Welcome to the webinar, Philippines Tourism Rebound, how domestic and China travellers will lead the recovery. I'm David Johnson, CEO of Delivering Asia Communications, and I'm your moderator today. COVID-19 has devastated the travel and tourism industry across the world. But today we want to focus on the positives and the story of the recovery of one of Asia's most desirable tourism destinations. The Philippines is armed with the best tourism campaign in Asia, great hospitality product, and the most iconic beach destinations. The question is, how can we put these to work to drive the recovery? Today we'll find out more about this story and how it is likely to play out, with the domestic market growing and the international market, led by China, in whatever form, whether it's corridors or we'll get into all that later, waiting in the wings. So I just wanted to introduce you to our speakers today. We have Jesper Palmquist, Area Director, Asia Pacific STR. We have Cindy Tan Karabata, CEO, President, Tajara Leisure and Hospitality. We have Tim Hallett, Consultant, Hospitality and Lifestyle Real Estate, NAI RCL Philippines. We have Bill Barnett, Managing Director of C9 Hotelworks, with whom we partnered in the China outbound travel sentiment study that we're going to talk about a little bit later, and Vanessa Zhu from our Shanghai office. So just quickly before we get cracking, a few housekeeping points. The session is going to last for 60 minutes. So there'll be short, data-driven presentations by each speaker, followed by a Q&A, which will focus on what's next. So please type your questions in the Q&A function below. I've received some Q&A, some questions already, which is great, and we'll get to those. But please, as the presentations go on, we'll record the Q&As as they pop up. And just the final point is that we will send the presentation, the master presentation, and the recording of the webinar to everyone who is participating in the session today. So let's get going. Jesper, please set the scene for us and give us some perspective on Philippines as a tourism destination. Jesper, please.
Thank you very much. Confirm sound check. You can see my screen?
Absolutely.
Yes. Excellent. Well, thanks for joining us, and thanks for having me in this group of industry titans. Now, please bear in mind, I'm making assumptions that you know a lot, that you've seen a lot in the news and what's happening, because I touch on recovery trends and stories in a tight time frame, and I will do some Philippines to pick things up for others here as well. Now, when it comes to all these things, hotels are being closed, and in China's case, also reopening. So 76% in Europe as of April. That's a lot of hotels. Now, small groups can use cash from saying, I'm going to be quarantine hotels, and some other of my hotels, I just have to close them. Because if you look at the financials behind it, if you're a full service or a limited hotel, it's not great to see how much you're affected. If you have occupancy below 20 or 30%, your GOP margins are down, so you need to just actually close because the fixed costs are running anyway. So a lot of hotels are closed, and that's the baseline of what we're seeing in the world for the last 4 months. Quick recovery theme. Hopefully you've seen and heard what's been going on in China. There was a big fall, a slow recovery. Interesting bit now is the recovery that we're seeing normal patterns, right? Weekday, weekend patterns beyond the leisure business on weekends. We're actually starting to see after the May Labor Day holiday in China, also business travel in MICE. This graph shows, yes, there was a holiday, people went back to work, but then business travel is now starting in China. In Shanghai, Beijing, and in main markets around the country, real business, if we call it that, is starting to come back. And that's probably everyone's looking at, how will that happen in my market, including in the Philippines? In South Korea, you read also about a recovery. It's very different because there's a big spike, as you can see, how markets recovered over a big holiday period. The trend is upwards, but it's more spiky and will take a little bit longer in our estimation in South Korea. But if you look on other markets that are likely to come a little bit sooner than others, because now we're starting to see the field spreading out. One of those markets is Vietnam. So they're looking like the leader in the ASEAN community in terms of opening up. All these factors on the screen there is how they're opening, right? The country's kind of open for business again. Borders are opening, and they're looking to do international flights. So this is something that all ASEAN countries will look at now. Which partners can I trade with? And Vietnam, in that sense, will compete with the Philippines, of course, in attracting the Chinese traveling over as well for the first business and leisure travel coming. But so what's next? So we can look on the business on the books and Forward Star and see what's happening. We're starting to see business coming even in Southeast Asia, say from Europe for December and January reservations early. A little bit opportunistic perhaps. We haven't seen that much because we need people around the world for that long haul need more confidence from authorities for that scale to generate. So we're talking domestic. An example here in the Pacific region. So New Zealand can celebrate today. They're opening up the country at level 2. They're trying to create a travel bubble with Australia that can perform well, and they depend on international travel for sure. Australia, very different. They can do domestic business and come out of this to a large degree, like Australia, like Indonesia, like India, and like Philippines. So there's a very big difference on how you're fundamentally set up as a country as well. But these countries are likely to come. Will it happen now? Well, not exactly now. This is showing Sydney data on the books for the next 90 days. There's almost nothing. Melbourne, well, October, a handful of bookings. So hold your horses a bit, but it's coming, but not just yet in some of those markets. So some of those factors affecting where we look at our 35 years of data, but also what's happened recently in China and other markets. Of course, it's domestic, it's local, accessible, and needs to be driven by social distancing and factors that are new to this kind of crisis. Yeah, leisure business, weekend, but already, like I said, in China, we're starting to see corporate business. MICE was just allowed the other day to start being planned within the Philippines, within China. So we're starting to see that kind of business where everyone's waiting for the Holy Grail, of course, international business and how that will affect. So big recovery curve. And I think these steps, so far, we haven't seen a flow in how they're paid out. But it was a slide down. My point around the domestic and national and various markets is the steps up back again is going to depend and vary a lot on how you're set up to these risks and many others. Because how you're set up with health certificate needs. Will there be limited air capacity in the short to midterm? Absolutely. Some airlines will not and cannot fly to all maybe resorts in the beginning as well. So a lot of these risks, everyone needs to study from a national level, regional, and city level as well, I would argue. And of course, the second wave of new cases can throw a spanner in the works. China and Korea so far managed that quite well. Now, I'm not going to mention the other countries. It's more the point around Maldives, say Singapore, and some of those countries that rely more on international travel will struggle perhaps and see that challenging. But Philippines has an opportunity with a large domestic market. I think Taiwan should be called out as well as an early potential travel partner since they are coming out of it soon. But on Philippines, to wrap up, now Singapore's isolation and quarantine guests around 70%, and that Philippines on 50%. What is behind that? Well, if you take the macro and the long view, occupancy been stable at a national level around 70% for a few years. The average daily rates since GFC up about 20%, but it's really, if you look at this graph here, it's in the last 18 months that rates, particularly in Manila and Makati, has driven up and gotten some good ADR lift. And then on supply, nothing crisis. It's been okay. It's been a couple of new projects that have maybe pushed the balance a bit on demand, but it hasn't really rocked like we've seen in, say, Vietnam or other markets to that point. Q1, obviously very different. Occupancy dropped 25%, but rates held up because the effect on the rates in Philippines overall wasn't really until the last 45 days. So we go back to this slide where it's 50%, right? So Philippines should be now 60, 65, 70% this time of year, sits there at 50. What is that business mix? Of course, it's BPOs that we'll get into in a second, repatriated Filipinos overseas, quarantine guests, etc. And they're using economy and mid-scale class hotels generally, which means the rates go down. Conclusions, hopefully you paid attention on the first two, so I don't have to repeat them. Let's focus on the real important stuff. The recovery will come in phases and depend on airlift. That goes without saying domestically, but absolutely international as well for the Philippines. And that demand, like I said, right now, it's not real demand, but it's new kind of demand. The BPO business, which the rest of the panel will talk about, repatriated citizen, quarantine guests, and also there's 15,000 rooms in that pipeline that we see. Delays are certainly expected in terms of new projects. And it depends on Manila and Cebu, wherever you are, we're seeing a little bit of a slowdown in some markets and how the current effects are happening. Go to our website for more of these slides, of course, as well. But if you're particularly interested in China, we just released version 4 today on particularly just on China recovery. So I will, with that, stop sharing and hand over to the rest of the panel and take any questions later on as well.
Jesper, thank you. Very insightful on macro level and drilling down to a domestic level latterly. To give us a little bit more insight, well, a lot more insight on that is Cindy Tan Darabata. Cindy, if you could join us, please, for tourism overview and to really have a look at the state of play on the ground. Cindy, please.
Hello. Hi, David. Thank you for that. Well, if you look at the Philippines, the 2020 should have been the golden age of tourism. 10 years ago, the contribution of tourism to the GDP is about 5.8%. And last year, we ended about 12.7%, which is pretty much the second biggest contributor to the GDP. If you look at domestic tourism, it represents about 25% of the household consumption. Philippines being an archipelago, the travels are not only in terms of air, there's land, ferries, people travel by boat, and also the Roro. Roro meaning roll on, roll off. That's pretty much how people, move around. 8.3 million international tourists. Last year was one of the biggest increase, which is about 15%. But if you look at the domestic travelers, we topped about 120 million. 53% of this is between the ages 15 to 34. Now, when you look at this number, this is what we call the demographic dividends, which is pretty much predicted 5 years ago. This is pretty much the traveling market as well. So more like families and pretty much friends traveling together. Tourism did not only bring in a lot of investments. It also, of course, spurred a lot of employment and at the same time brought a lot of national pride among the Filipinos. Top 4 airports in terms of foreign arrivals would be Metro Manila, Cebu, and we just renovated, expanded Cebu Airport. Calibo, primarily because it's the gateway to Boracay. You do have a lot of the chartered flights there, international flights. And Clark is also being expanded. If you look at the Philippine tourist arrival, the top 10 would, this is pretty much a top 10 source market. And the top 6 there, if you look at it, is pretty much our top 6 for the past, 5 years or so. One significant, well, if you look at, say, China has been growing double digit for the past 5 years already. So last year they grew something like about 38% and Taiwan at about 35%. So where are we now? We're actually still in quarantine. If you look at the cases in the Philippines, being an archipelago, pretty much there are some regions it's pretty much high risk, the others are low risk. So we also identified there are 4 levels now in terms of quarantine. So we get into this moderate ECQ, we call it ECQ, which is like, or enhanced quarantine, community quarantine, which is pretty much equivalent maybe Singapore's circuit breaker. So Philippines gets into, well, Manila specifically gets into a moderate ECQ this weekend up until, we tried for another 2 weeks, which also includes Cebu. But we need to, so some areas pretty much already opened up a bit and some low risk areas are no longer in quarantine. But what is important is that private establishment, well, the thing is all private establishment, most of them are actually closed except for those that provides essential goods. Of course, government offices are open and like what Jesper said earlier, also BPO offices. Definitely strict quarantine for every household and there's no public transportation. So if you look at travel restrictions, we last early May and we just got the announcement that all major airlines are still not flying commercially, but if there's anything quite important is that we have 990 hotels that are that actually are open, This is to service pretty much OFWs, the BPOs. It's pretty much the work from home situation. But a lot of these hotels are 50% of the hotels that are open are pretty much at Metro Manila. So if you look at the lockdown, before the lockdown, we actually felt the decline of tourist arrivals already. So how do we recover? I mean, if you look at domestic market, how do we recover from, I wouldn't say a full recovery, I'd say a slow recovery. For domestic market, we did something with Horwath last month, of which the first to come up is the first to bounce back would be business, MICE, and I'd like to go into MICE later on again. FIT leisure, then you have the group leisure. But before we get off and before we kind of recover, you have to look at lifting lockdown first. Then you go into domestic airlifts. I mean domestic flights to to resume. So what's important also is that to know is that when the lockdown is over, we're likely looking at domestic. I mean, pretty much family, friends traveling, but also on nearby regions. So which means if I'm in Manila, I'll go to say Tagaytay or Batangas. People definitely want to go to the beach, get into diving. They want to do outdoor activities. Definitely no MICE business just yet, no conferences, and health safety protocols will also have to be observed. For the international market, we see business coming in first, then leisure travel. I mean FIT groups. But if there's anything when we're doing some we talk to hotel owners, wholesalers. One thing that would most likely bounce back once international flights are open has resumed is that business travelers from Japan and China would most likely be traveling to the Philippines, primarily because of the infrastructure projects with the build program with the government. For leisure, you do have Korea. I mean, pretty much our top three would be traveling just primarily to look at they want to go to the beach. And one specific market we're looking at is pretty much also Japan, because they promoted what they call the Ankentan destination, which means inexpensive short haul travel and pretty much close to Japan. So on how do we rebound? Well, I would say semi-rebound, more like not totally rebound for 2020. Definitely, there's higher standards and protocol for. Say these are the things that has to be looked into. There is what we call the Project ARC, which is led by the private sector. So it's a mass testing, but since government can't afford all the testing, private sector also has stepped in terms of how the rapid testing. One of the things that's pretty important is that a lot of people also want to be out of the quarantine. You have to give pretty much private sector to try out and even especially resume public transportation. We need to reopen. We need to test market or consumer sentiments. The government is also working on a stimulus package. And what we want is to be able to get people to train people as well. So anyway, this stimulus package is pretty much working on giving subsidy wages and so on. But what's important is to reopen the hotels and also to lift the travel bans. We need to get into this what we call baptism of fire and just try out and rather than just keep everyone on lockdown.
Thank you, Cindy. That's great. We're going to get into the baptism of fire shortly. But first, we've got Tim Hallett up next, and Tim's going to give us some market intelligence on the hospitality industry. Tim, please. Tim, you need to unmute, please.
Sorry.
That's great. Thank you.
Apologies. I'm back online. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Jasper, initially, and Cindy. Yeah, I'm just going to talk about, Cindy has covered some issues and some comment as of Jasper. I'm just going to try and put a little bit more clarity and begin to look at not just hospitality, but how some of the key drivers through BPO are going to be affecting the current situation and really how potentially they will affect the growth. So, as Cindy has said, Philippine tourism was one of the bright stars of our economy. Amazing arrivals, a lot of development growth, new destinations opening up, driven by new airport infrastructure development. It was a really exciting place to be, and still is. Don't get us wrong, but it's just a matter of we need to get these projects back going again. Contribution to GDP, tourism is massive here in the Philippines. Almost 3 trillion pesos, 500 million of which from international arrivals, which pretty much shows you how strong and powerful the domestic economy is and certainly will be. And as Cindy's pointed out, interestingly, that will be one of the main drivers as we begin to enter into recovery. Massive amount of people employed in the hospitality industry, 6 million of the population, 15% of those employed, which is a big number, and that excludes all the millions, I'm guessing, of casual staff that are working in the industry. We all know that many smaller hotels and resorts have closed. Some international branded hotels are remained open, but their business is limited from those guests that were able to be locked in prior to the lockdown, and then obviously some business driven by the ability for BPOs and such like to stay in the hotels. Just a quick look at the arrivals, and I'll skip through this quite quickly because Cindy's touched on this, but we can see the massive drop. There was consistent growth. The tourism campaigns, David, as you quite rightly pointed out, were very dynamic, and they were improving on an annual basis, and we were really beginning to reach the market. We got positive news about Philippines as a key player in the tourism business. Occupancy rates, and now we're focusing purely on sort of the national capital region here, but we can see where we sort of stand today in terms of general occupancy. Generally, CBD Manila, 23%. Some of the suburbs coming in, in the mid to high 20s. We've got some areas which are like Taguig City, for instance, which is strongly populated by BPOs. So obviously, a lot of BPOs are using those hotels and have negotiated some pretty interesting contracts with some of those hotel operators. So moving on, let's take a look at sort of the developments and the projects. Development pipeline. Now, Jasper's mentioned a strong pipeline. We do have a positive pipeline here in the capital plus growth pipeline in the regions and the islands, but it's pretty much on hold. Most developers now quite significantly have put their projects on hold, both large ones and small, and they're furloughing their future, reconsidering how they move ahead. And the question will remain, as to whether all of them will go ahead and how will they be repositioned. We're seeing a lot of questions coming from many developers asking, how can we move ahead? How do we reposition? What will the business be like? It's really tough to answer at the moment until we begin to see some movements in some of the macro areas that both Cindy and Jesper have talked about. But it's developers are considering all options, and I think it's a really important process for us to as the industry to begin to communicate and begin to work together and share information and help everybody through the next stages of the crisis. Now, we've seen here, Cindy has already mentioned again, domestic travel, and I certainly believe that domestic travel is going to be the first driver of recovery, and particularly those destinations that are drive-to destinations that don't have to rely on lift. I think it's really important that the government is very proactive here, and I think it's also extremely important that they keep their foot on the accelerator to keep things moving in some of the major tourism and development projects as we move ahead. Lots of stimulus going back to government again. The DOT, Department of Tourism, has been granted 43 billion to assist the tourism industry. 36 billion of which potentially going to be channeled into soft loans for tourism enterprises. 4 billion infrastructure. So a lot of positive investment back into driving recovery, assisting not just the major developers, the infrastructure developers, but importantly the smaller, more boutique developers, which we have lots of out in the islands that are really going to struggle to get a foothold into a potential recovery situation. We talked earlier on, and David mentioned the strength of the tourism development campaigns here, and you can see there's money going to be channeled into those campaigns as well. So again, a lot of positive talk and suggestions going to be introduced into the market. A little bit on the supply, and again, I'm not going to dwell on this too long, but if we look in the metro CBDs post-COVID, you've got a room supply of 40 to 41,000 rooms, and 6,500 or 7,000 rooms in the development supply, which are due to open in the next 3 years. It's going to be, watch this space to see how that is going to be altered, how that's going to be delayed. And, some of it is going to be driven by the factor, particularly down where the big casinos are, where a lot of the inventory is being developed, how the BPOs, how the POGOs, the online gaming business begins to recover and reactivate. And we see how that important sector in our in the country is going to begin to contribute to the recovery. Let's just touch a little bit on the BPO industry. Whilst this is a hospitality tourism sector, but BPOs are a significantly important sector. We've got 851 registered BPOs, 429 are call centers. You've got the POGOs now coming into the BPO sector and being recognized as BPOs, so they're able to be treated from a legislative perspective and get open. We've got certainly 1.2 million, it says here, but I think it's more people employed in the BPO sector. And of course, they're able to operate during the lockdown. Even during the ECQ, BPOs were allowed to operate, largely because of the global presence that they have and the support they're giving to so many countries in terms of communicating with their clientele, whether it be banking, whether it be IT, etc. Interesting, and this has been touched on a little bit already, but in order to ensure that the workers are available, they're safe, and the social distancing and the sanitation requirements are met, 15,000 hotel rooms have been allocated, and this is probably an underestimate, where a lot of the BPA workers have been billeted. So again, the hotel space has benefited significantly from the BPO sector, and both the BPO and the POGO sector are now out negotiating group purchases and taking over multiple smaller hotels and even significant floors on larger hotels. We can see here that the numbers we have is that more than 200 of these hotels across the Philippines have participated to date in the BPO sector, 160 of which are in Manila. I think the trend is definitely set to continue post-COVID, and as BPOs continue to grow and begin to provide services globally, the fact that this work from home, digital-based mentality that we're needing to move to, not so many offices, the importance of digital connection, digital communication can only continue to benefit the growth in this sector, which ultimately is going to significantly affect the effect of how tourism and how hotel occupancy can recover, albeit there may be some changes to distribution strategies and revenue management strategies within the hotel space. Just lastly, just a few sort of KPIs in the BPO sector for those that don't necessarily know much about it. I mean, it's a big space, and average rents, you know, are currently sort of around about 1,000 pesos per square meter. And you can see in the top right here where most of the BPOs in Manila are located anyway. I mean, we really haven't gone into the regional markets and other destinations where BPOs are also growing rapidly. Occupancy, well, you know, you can see that you have a very, very strong occupancy rate, particularly in the Bay Area, Pasay, where again, you know, there's a preponderance of POGOs there, which drive that because of the casino market down there. But you can see it's a very, very strong, healthy rental strategy, occupancy strategy, and again, does set the benchmark for opportunity and supply as well. There's a lot of new office development, a lot of new supply coming on, and I think, you know, that not just properties that are going to take 12 or 18 or 24 months to turn over. There are space now. There's opportunities now to move BPOs into these buildings, and I think you're going to see a little bit of opportunity strategy to actually, you know, reposition some of the office sector into BPOs as we begin to see the demand grow as recovery begins to move forth. So, I mean, that's me. I hope it's given everybody a little bit of an insight. And as everybody said, I mean, we have you know, we want to focus on Q&A, and I'm sure we want to address many of the questions that the audience have. And please drop your questions on the Q&A section of the Zoom app. Thank you, everybody, and I'm handing over to Bill, I believe. Yeah.
Thank you, Tim. That's great and very insightful. We're going to move swiftly on to Bill Barnett. Bill Barnett's going to talk about it. Going to look a little bit further ahead, ahead to the China market. Bill, please.
Baptism of fire, and I think the main thing we're talking about today is being the ball, right? I've got my ball here. Actually, I need some air in my ball too. It's not actually, yeah, definitely. We're in quarter one of the game, and I think when we're talking about recovery or rebound, why are we saying rebound? Is it too early to talk about rebound? In the Philippines, 12.7% of GDP is tourism. It's the face and nation of your country. You know, it's so important to brand Philippines about what tourism is. It's not only a tourism cycle, but it's also an economic, it's a sense of what your belonging and your brand is. So how important is that? So when we're talking about recovery, again, we're in quarter one today, okay? This is the road back. We're not saying that everything's going to be okay in 3 or 6 months. It's not going to be. You know, we unequivocally saying this is a journey backwards. You know, the score right now, we're probably 20-1 right now in terms of our way back, but how we're going to get back in the game. What we've understood also is for the domestic market is fine to talk about, but without the international market as well, the Philippines is not going to be competitive with Thailand, with Vietnam, with other ASEAN countries as well. It's where's the overseas market? And for us, much of it is going to be with airlift, and much of it's going to be about protocols. How are the Philippines going to have bilateral agreements with what countries to say? And you know, for the Philippines, we have to look at 45% of your markets are Korea and mainland China. Like it or not, this is fish where the fish are. And something we understand is it's nice to look at English or nice to look at Tagalog and say, what are people thinking about our products? But you've got to look at what Chinese sentiment is or Korean sentiment. That's not in English. If I go to China, I'm not looking at Facebook. I'm not looking at Google. I'm not looking at these type of things. I'm looking at social media. So we've gone to the mainland China and we've looked at 5 first-tier cities across China, also in the north, Beijing, Shanghai. We've looked at Guangzhou in the south. We've looked at these markets and what do people think about the Philippines? These are qualified travelers. I think when we go back, you just look at the slide here, we understand how important China is to the market. So again, that's a key player for us as well. Fish where the fish are. Now we've conducted our survey. We've got results in for the first week of May. What I want to stress today is sentiment today may be different sentiment 6 months from now and a year from now. This is not the mass market. Because if you're a hotelier, you've got to fish where the fish are. You have short-term strategies. The hotel business is a backwards business. A 365-day business plan is meaningless in a crisis. And you have to look and say, where am I going to see international markets come this year? Where am I going to invest money this year? I think what's really key for us when we look about the destinations in the Philippines, aside from Manila, we understood the power of some of the beach destinations where people look at space. Boracay, Bohol surprisingly ranked above Cebu, which is interesting because the reputation, when we looked online in Chinese social media, we understand the power of brand Bohol and understand what people are looking for. And I think there's going to be a fear factor coming in. People aren't going to want to get on, it's door-to-door travel time and it's spatial destinations. This is where the Philippine beach destinations are going to shine as a priority when you're looking at mainland Chinese or Korean customers as well. Again, I think certainly when we go in other points as well, 82% demand is independent. This is early demand. So people are saying now is you can influence those people to come. It's important when we look at how many people said are planning to travel in 2020. Again, 55% saying they want to travel overseas. No surprises here when we look about which months they want to come, because October, again, national holidays towards the end of the year. But interesting enough, when we've got no plan, because no plan presents itself as an opportunity. It means that people want to travel abroad, they want to travel to the Philippines, but yet they're still going to decide when and where they're going to go. So this, yes, is a key subject, because they're not saying, I'm not planning a trip to Paris 2 years from now, I'm going to plan something this year. And that's the first step. Tourism going backwards, maybe going to the second quarter being the ball is, it's going to be baby steps when you go back on. You know, we can't say that this crisis is unprecedented, but it's not. 9/11, people took their shoes off. In America and the world took their shoes off, but it's baby steps. It's going to people to get on the airplanes, take short visits, inter-regional visits as well. So I think that's really profound for us when we look at the Chinese market as well, about where are the travelers going to be coming from. I think something we also look about, again, it's interesting here because the Philippines ranks quite good in terms of people, you know, Chinese who would like to come to the Philippines. I mean, I live in Thailand, and Thailand's had issues with the Chinese in 2018 in terms of safety factors and everything else. And if I look at the online reputation isn't from press clippings. It's not necessarily from state media. It's social media. It's the influencers. And what are these people saying is there's quite a positive feeling when we look at different destinations in China for visitors who want to come to the Philippines. When they look at Boracay, when they look at the comments later on towards Manila even, and Bohol, Cebu. And it was interesting that Palawan and Davao weren't the preferred destinations, which means those destinations actually have some work to do, you know, in terms of trying to penetrate that market. Again, what do we say? Why do people, what's their primary motivation? I think if we would have done this a few years ago, sightseeing is an obvious one. Certainly eating is an obvious one, but nature, again, I think anybody who was stuck in Wuhan during the lockdown, they want to get out and they want to see something natural. It's not, you can't generalize about the Chinese population. If you'd go back to 1970s, 1980s, Japanese followed the flag, and today there's some of your more affluent global travelers. Everything has an evolution, and who are these customers? But nature is going at higher priority now, and our value systems are changing. And again, when we look at these destinations, Boracay has a golden reputation in China. You know, it's certainly there. It's also compared to the Maldives. It's interesting when we look on social media how that reputation is, you know, and it's compared to be less dense than Thailand or other destinations in ASEAN, including Bali as well. So that was an interesting comment. So, you know, you have great selling advantages and good social media buzz on the mainland. That's important, I think. I think in terms of travel preferences, you know, again, this was another interesting statistic as independent traveler. You think of Chinese, you think of a tour bus, you think of everybody going together. There is a preference towards early travelers. And today, again, we're looking this year, 2020, who's going to travel, or early next year. And these are independent travelers. You got to work on a profile and know your customers. Too often we talk about product or we talk about blank marketing campaigns. You know, understand what people are looking for, who these travelers are. And there's an independent movement there. And certainly what was another interesting thing is 4-star hotels. And when we go back to the makeup of this survey, you know, in terms, there was a high amount of female travelers, and that kind of pushed the 4-star level as well, because they assume that to be more of a safer option. In other countries, when we looked at Thailand, we looked at Vietnam, that hotel preference was different. You know, in terms of, for the Philippines, it was elevated as the demographic changed to more females, which is important. And this is encouraging because generally speaking, you think about Chinese coming for 2.5 days as average length of stay in ASEAN short haul destinations. And this means there's appetite for people who want to see a lot of things. And again, when we go back to distribution, it goes backwards to how are you going to be booking? C-Trip continues to rule the airways there, but we're seeing Fliggy, we're seeing hotel websites, we're seeing WeChat come up and social media. And I think that's really an important aspect because you're able to get back to clients quite quickly in terms of that. I think in terms of surveying, again, company employees, a company employee could be anybody from a manager to a supervisor to the head of a company, in terms of that. So I think that's, that's where the bulk of people who are traveling to the Philippines are talking about coming from. Age distribution is important, younger travelers, right? And I think when we look at female travelers, 58%, 20 to 29, digitally knowledgeable, saying they understand how to use the internet and choose the destination. That's where you're shooting in terms of getting some volume back into the model. I think that's quite important. And again, in terms of the spend per trip, people always say that Chinese want something for nothing and the travelers, they want to go on the cheapest possible trip. But there is value here when we look at actually what the budgets are. This is not, again, people understand the value proposition in the Philippines because the airfares and everything else, but this is a good spend. And again, it isn't saying you're just going after cheap markets. So I think China continues to be an important one and something we've highlighted. I think going forward, I think that long haul markets are not going to be expected to return until next year. Tourism recovery is going to recall on protocols or bilateral agreements between your country and other countries. Airlift is everything. You can't stay there if you can't get there. And the lower prices for domestic flights and value-added tour packages, I think are kind of interesting as well. And again, there is money in the system to go back in and say, but it's not just domestic. I think probably the worst thing would be to go back into the cocoon, and the Philippines has to be competitive with Vietnam. It has to be competitive with Thailand. It's a world-class destination, So when we say Philippines, be the ball, Philippines. Rebound, you're in the first quarter, but where are you going to fish internationally as well? That's going to define your path forward to a recovery that could be 2 years or 3 years. But again, you're going to improve every quarter going forward. David, I think we're going to go over to Vanessa now and start talking social media.
Bill, thank you. That's excellent. Great insights. The post-COVID traveler is changing. Younger, more independent, more experience-driven, and staying longer. These are great signals. The question is how to reach them. And we're going to have Vanessa Ju in our office in Shanghai. Just going to give some insights because there's a new ecosystem of social media evolving that people need to look at, the industry needs to look at to be able to tap into this traveler. Vanessa. Vanessa, I can't hear you. Can you unmute?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So yeah, exactly. I would like to share some information about how to reach Chinese customer. So as we know, Weibo, WeChat, those are the normal way we use right now to reach Chinese customer. But however, during the COVID quarantine time, there's some ecosystem. First one I want to talking about is a Fliggy. So FIT is has their unique behavior pattern. So they use a Fliggy. We probably know Ctrip and other, but Fliggy is more like each hotel or destination each destination service open their own store in front in the Fliggy. So it's like you have your own store and you are facing the customer directly. And then we use Alipay. Some of you probably already familiar with Alipay. That Chinese traveler, they tend to use a mobile phone, scan on the QR code, and then pay them directly. So via Fliggy, via Alipay, you scan the QR code, then the money will transfer directly from the customer into your own pocket. And Fliggy and Alipay are both owned by Alibaba. So this is one of the ecosystem. And the next one I would like to share with you actually is a new media tool apps called TikTok. The name in Chinese is called Douyin. So during the COVID quarantine time, people all stay at home doing nothing. So besides they watch WeChat and Weibo daily, there's a lot of free time now. So there's TikTok. Douyin has been filling in the gap. So Douyin basically is a tool, mobile phone driven, and then it's has a lot of feeding. So you can provide a lot of video and audio, and people like to flip them and watch them, and then to watch some fun thing to do entertainment. So each video lasts about 30 to 3 minutes right now, and it's a very useful tool right now for people to purchasing stuff, such as the Douyin actually can insert Fliggy link. So people watch it, like it, and the result purchasing and paid by Alipay. So all three of them, all owned by Alibaba. either completely or partially. So these three tools combined together became an ecosystem, which has been widely used by people in around 30 or above, like between, yeah. So like young people, especially the FIT group, like to use all three these tools quite oftenly. So I think this will open a new gate for the overseas tourism market.
Vanessa, that sounds absolutely great. I think it's 85% or 86% of the independent travelers surveyed are below 40. So the independent traveler market is exploding. It's the first mover market, if you like, out of China. Is this the end of the group tour? We don't know. One question for you quickly before we've had a whole host of questions, and I'm going to get to them. I'm going to ask you the question first, if you don't mind. Independent travelers from China. Why do independent travelers from China want to visit the Philippines? What is the key draw?
Oh, wow. There's two reasons. One is, so we discover all the people tend to going out, are all repeating visitors. So they would like to do their yesterday once more. So to go travel international, to refill the feeling about to travel the experience destination, to feel like the life is getting back to normal. And the other thing is Philippines has beach, has a wonderful diving, those kind of unbeatable underwater scenery. All of this is a uniqueness about the Philippines. So that's why Chinese people, especially dive or people like water sports, like to go into Philippines. Cebu, Bohol, Boracay are all the very hot destination for them.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to get to some of the other questions here. Cindy, for you first, if you don't mind. A couple of questions here. I'm afraid this is probably a fairly tough one. When will hotels open in the Philippines? And what are the key protocols that hotels should undergo to get the confidence of travelers? Cindy.
Well, in the first place, we really have to be out of the lockdown. The quarantine has also affected a lot of the businesses. Protocols, I'd say the heightened hygiene standards. So I know that the Department of Tourism is working on like a unified seal of safety excellence. But we're also putting together, all hotel owners are actually also putting together their own version of what could be a higher standard for that. But I think that's what will get guest confidence for them to actually book in the hotels. But first, again, step by step, people are saying baby steps. I call it more cha-cha-cha, in a sense wherein you need to try out first, then back up a bit. If it doesn't work, then try it again. So what's important is a lot of the hotel people, and especially the owners, to put some sort of and lobby it into government. We need to just get out of the lockdown. I think we have to take those steps first. It's hard to predict.
Okay, just talking about, it's very hard to predict. It's changing on a daily basis. I'd quite like to, there's been a lot of questions about travel corridors, the travel bubble. And I know you touched on that, Jesper. If you'd like just to talk about that a little bit more, what sort of models are we looking at, and how effective can these corridors be?
Well, it kind of goes back to the point around which, how much I think people will attack it differently if you are more dependent on international arrivals or not, because as we keep saying, domestic first and everything, and a market that relies so much on it can make sure they put all eggs in that and really make sure that drives and grows, because when you come out of the business, those are also countries that sometimes have said we are too heavily reliant on international arrivals, right? So that changes it a bit. But in terms of those bubbles, now there are geographical place that works very well, like Australia and New Zealand. But I think Taiwan and Vietnam, who are now ready to come out, they're saying we're ready to start traveling soon, and who's ready to do it with us? Of course, they will look at China as one of the biggest trading partner for them in that sense in travel. And China is also coming out of it. Japan is very keen to see arrivals with their boom, but all those authority decisions need to be made first. No one wants to be the first one to make that mistake that we have open up, right? Maybe Bill's president has a different view, but a lot of people around the world are thinking like, how will our leaders try to open this up? Because it's, we'll call it baby steps. I think The governments that react to this in the best possible way, choose the right trading partner politically, will be the ones that see this coming out and really benefit of that holy grail of international travel, just beyond that domestic.
Thanks. There's been a lot of questions just over the last few moments about there's a fear factor. There's a fear factor about people are still in lockdown. And we're talking about travel corridors. We're talking about opening up as quickly as possible to get things on. I mean, realistically, what is the likelihood of a second or third wave of this happening? Who wants to take something like that? Bill?
Well, I think it's interesting because anybody who's married certainly wants to get out of their house now. So, I mean, I don't know about you, but, you know, I'd love to take a trip. Sorry. I think one thing we've got to understand about, you know, we can talk about the fear factor and everything else, but at the end of the day, there's baby steps coming out of this. And I think what's more intriguing for me is we talk about what the new traveler is going to be. And I'm sorry, I'm going to 360 a little on you there, but I'm going to say, when we're saying about this, there's self-distancing, but what about, you know, in terms of self-distancing and everything else? But, you know, how is this going to change the social experience of hotels are perceiving? Because are you going to want to go to a hotel? And I think that difference is physical distancing. Too often, we're getting into questions now, hotels are going to change completely. You know, I go backwards to a social experience hotel now and 300 years ago in England, which is a pub with some rooms upstairs and a social experience. It's the same thing. It's cyclical as well. But I think what we have to work out are things like physical distancing or social distancing and find out how we're going to do that, because you'll feel safe to go on shorter trips. And I think that plays into domestic market. It plays into short haul trips where people take a short trip on an airplane that they don't have somebody in a seat next door as well. But, you know, that's going to have to, you know, again, it's going to be baby steps, but somebody's going to do it. Vietnam is doing it. Thailand is starting to open it. And we're going to see, you know, by sheer force of will, the Philippines will have to follow. And it goes back to that. I think that's what's going to follow. But to me, the whole hotel experience will reinvent, but it's not going to completely change.
Right. I mean, and there's a lot of questions on this too. I mean, advice, what should hotels do? I mean, we talk about social distancing, we talk about sanitizers, we talk about, I mean, what are some of the key things that hotels should do so that they can be, so that travelers can be totally confident they're going to be okay there? Cindy, back to you.
Okay, well, we talked about the hygiene protocols, right? But I just feel that we need to open slowly. I mean, people saying, okay, government, but the thing is, until you take those baby steps, you actually don't know what's going to happen. I mean, we just heard last night, a few days ago, like South Korea also had a bit of a second wave and they're trying to contain it. That's why I mentioned about the baptism of fire up until we've tried it. First is to get out of the lockdown. First is to lift the travel bans slowly. So it could be domestic and then slowly short hauls for international travelers. So right now, like each and every country also approaches it differently and depends on government on how they want to tackle those issues.
Tim, I'm going to take you out of your comfort zone a little bit here, if that's all right. I'm going to ask you an airline question. There's been a few on airlines. It seems it's interesting. Out of the survey from China, there's some interesting information about direct to beaches. How can airlines get direct to beaches, point to point? There was far more favourable views on the key beach destinations than urban destinations. You know, what can airlines do? What should airlines be doing to inspire the confidence of travel? And what maybe could the airport authorities or on the ground in the Philippines do to make sure they can accept long haul flights?
Well, thanks, David. Yeah, the multi-million-dollar question. You know,
but it's the lift, isn't it? You need to have the lift.
It's the lift.
Yes.
It's all about lift, and you know, we are. You know, in the future, we're going to be lucky in the Philippines because we've got, you know, lots of new international airports open up in the provinces and some of the islands, which is good. We're not really there yet, so it's going to be focused in just a few destinations. So that's always going to be a challenge. But I guess in terms of what airlines have to do, it's actually not too dissimilar to what a hotel has to do at the end of the day. It's about making people comfortable to fly. And, you know, you've got the airport authorities going through the protocols. I mean, you read some really good stuff about what's going on in Dubai, about, you know, medical checks and health checks. before you can even check onto the plane, they're trying to get people to get there 3 or 4 or 5 hours early to go through this. So you've got that check process. You've got the personal hygiene, face mask strategy that everybody has to go through. The airlines, in terms of cleanliness and sanitizing airplanes. And then the big question is, which is the one that the airlines hate, and we've all seen lots of media on this, is, how do we space people in a plane? Because, even if you put somebody in every other seat, you're still way away from 2 meters away from them. Yeah. So I think it's all about the way that we make the market, we make the traveler more comfortable. Yeah. So I guess that's going to improve with time. But, I think we need to over communicate. If you go back to some of the stuff that Vanessa was talking about social media, I think we really need to leverage our digital communications, communicating with people about, the protocols that everybody is clearly going to take. But it's very emotional, isn't it? And, there's some people that are going to be brave. I mean, we've seen the news media and what's going on in the US and even in the UK, people out on the streets partying on beaches. Some people are very gung-ho about this, whereas some people are sort of, you haven't seen them for months. They just lock themselves in. So I think it's a tough question. I mean, Cindy.
No,
David,
thank you.
Add on
Yes,
a
please.
little on the airlines. I spoke to the head of the airline carriers. Like Philippine Airlines, AirAsia, and also Cebu Pacific are raring to go. They don't necessarily have to open, to start flying in Cebu and those key areas. There are low level risk in, say, General Santos, Iloilo, Bacolod. So they're ready to fly in those destinations. They do understand their risk, and maybe even if they don't, fly in full capacity, but you need to start. I mean, that goes also for a lot of the hotels. And it's something I need to mention. When you look at the hotel industry, we don't operate like a vacuum. There's a lot of industries that's pretty much attached to the hospitality. You're talking about meat suppliers, beverage suppliers, and then tricycle drivers, the divers, the boatmen. I mean, this whole gig economy pretty much also relies on hospitality. Mm-hmm. So that's the reason why we really urge everyone, and especially government, to just give us a shot. I mean, that baptism of fire, we need to get there. We can't be frozen. We cannot just stop what we're doing. I mean, we're actually on the 3rd month of the lockdown. It's no joke. You have a lot of these SMEs that needs to start up. We need to restart economy. We really do.
Thanks,
and that's
Cindy.
why I think,
Bill,
Cindy, I mean, yeah. So just quickly, as an industry, I mean, everybody on this webinar today, and I'm sure a lot of the guests, we got to work together to sort of, get these, help people get the right standards in place, to give people confidence to come back and open up, because, we've all been through many crises, and I think, the general synopsis is, when things begin to roll, they begin to roll. People gain confidence, and it's all about building that confidence in the market, whether it's airlines, whether it's hotels, whether it's restaurants. I mean, everybody, is suffering, and they're just, baby steps, but build confidence.
Thanks, Tim. Bill, would you like to add something about airlines? Just quick before we leave that one.
Well, I think definitely, in terms of airplanes getting to the beach, unless you crash land, you're not going to be easily landing on the beach there or going to Iloilo. But one thing we should be talking about is resorts and how the new hotel experience. I think there's a tremendous opportunity for resort destinations, because our resort destinations, everybody's worried about foreigners now coming to their country and having COVID, everything else. And, we're going backwards in terms of the whole experiential thing, everything else. So people are going to stay in the hotels. This is an opportunity for governments to say, fine, we'll send you to Hall, we'll send you to Cebu. You'll be in the resort there. You're okay. They can combine the experience. And those are good first steps. I think that hotel experience, I think the resort markets certainly are great first adopters of having foreign guests come to the market, because you're able to isolate them in a resort experience and say, this is going to be a safe destination. You have perimeters to that. And again, for hotels, it's ideal, because people are going to come back and spend money on room service. So hotels can reinvent themselves. And for every threat, and this is a terrible tragedy, but there's opportunity. And for hotels that are losing revenue now, you're going to have people coming back and says, let's have all-inclusive tourism. Let's have breakfast, lunch, and dinner in the hotel. Instead of getting out of the box, people now want to go back inside the box. And that, to me, is important. Yeah.
Thanks, Bill.
Sure.
Thanks, Bill. Yes, Bill, would you like to make one comment on that before we close about resorts leading the recovery in the Philippines?
Yeah, and I can, if we look at what's happened already in China and Korea, I think that's the point, because we've seen, yes, a drive to first and train to in China's case, but then flights, absolutely. People fly to Hainan, they fly to Sanya, and then not just stay in Halong Bay, they're staying around, not Halong Bay, but Haitang Bay and Yalong Bay. They're staying across Hainan, and they're also going in Korea, they're flying to Jeju. So these big countries, you know, in one way, it's like, it's an overseas, flights are happening, people are ready to go there. There are enough security measures from a health perspective in place for that to work. We've seen it in Jeju, we've seen it in Hainan, and to Bill's point, they come to the resort, they enjoyed themselves. It was 100% occupancy in, you know, Chandao Lake, around Hangzhou area. There's been 100% occupancies in hotels in Asia in the last few weeks. I think that, for me, is like, okay, we are getting somewhere. There are hotels that can adapt quickly to it. So operational excellence, good management, trying to get hold of that. I think there's an opportunity in the next few months, even if, yes, 2022 is when everything's back to normal.
Thank you, Jesper. Love finishing on a positive note, and on that very positive note, I'm going to say thank you to you, Jesper Palmquist. Thank you very much, Bill Barnett, Tim Hallett. Thank you so much, Vanessa Ju in Shanghai. Thanks so much, and of course, Cindy Tan Jerabata. Thank you so much indeed, everyone, for joining today.
Thanks, guys. It's more fun in the Philippines.
Everybody.
Hey.
Bye.
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 Bye.